Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start a little early today because we have this amazing program and we want to make sure that there's plenty of time for everyone. So we're really delighted you're here. And the best part about this program is, number one, all you guests, you're welcome. We're delighted to have you here. But then the other best part is that I'm going to sit down now and have Rick Pennell talk.
Well, you can sit now. Thank you. The order may be a little different today. So today, each one of the program speakers have been in Vietnam. Each will have a short story of before they went or after they came home. We won't be talking about in country. The Vietnam era, as many of you probably know, is a very volatile time. The draft was very unpopular. The war was very unpopular, and especially unpopular with older teens and 20-year-olds who were probably going to be drafted. College campuses and organizations and cities, very violent, lots of violent demonstrations. Unfortunately, it was the returning Vietnam veterans and even the active military that was here that took the brunt of those people and those demonstrations. So each of us today will have a different story and experience that we had in Vietnam, just as we did when we returned. So today, this will be our story. I'd like to now ask everyone to be silent while I introduce these groups of people, and then we will present the colors. And when that's all done, then I will let you know when we could go ahead. I'd like to first introduce some Gold Star families. For those of you that don't know what a Gold Star family is, that's a family that's lost a relative, a family member in combat. So I'd like to first introduce, and I'd like them to come up here, Rob and Sandy Adams. Sandy's brother was a 20-year-old corporal, Richard Nelson. He was killed in Cambodia on May 1970 and was awarded the Bronze Star for heroism. Next, I'd like to invite Dick and Amy to come to the forward. Dick Rowland and Amy Seeley. Dick's brother, Lance Corporal Tom Rowland, 23 years old, was killed in an attack on Navy Marine base at Marble Mountain. Now I'd like to have all of the Vietnam veterans who are here today that served in country to please come forward and stand in line in front here. A common greeting, and still happens amongst Vietnam veterans, is "Welcome home, brother." I was in Portland a week ago, and I was in a meeting, and a man walked in, and he had a cowboy hat, and he had first cav and the dates when he was in Vietnam. And immediately he said, "And you?" I said, I gave him my dates. He said, and we both immediately went into "Welcome home, brother." The lady I was at the meeting when he left. She says, what happened? You don't even know each other. I says, "Oh yeah, we do know each other." And that's a sign that we always do with our brothers from Vietnam, because we weren't welcomed home. So we welcome ourselves home. I'd like now all the Vietnam era veterans to come forward. All those that served during the Vietnam era, please come forward. Anyone that served during the Vietnam era in the military was exposed to the same problems the Vietnam veterans. They were serving their country during a very volatile time, and that's why we honor all Vietnam era veterans. I would now like to welcome our special color guard today. Please stand for the Yakima Warriors. My story. This is your story. Now you can show your respect for these men and women. All of you that are standing here, please stay after the program. The Warriors would like to present us with pins and T-shirts, and Lorna wants to take pictures to all of us. So thank you both. Thank you all. You can take your seats. For those of you that are young enough not to remember this era, that one of the, and you, as you hear some of the stories today, you have to remember that all military stood out during that era. All men had really long hair. And if you had short hair, I don't care where you were, they knew you were in the military. So keep that in mind when you hear about those stories. I was a second lieutenant. It was 6 months. I'd been in the Army 6 months, and as a second lieutenant, went to Vietnam. And I was a platoon leader in a what they call 4 Corps of the Delta, and where I served for my year there. And then I came back, and I will tell the rest of that story in just a minute. When I arrived from Vietnam, I arrived in some air base in California. I don't remember it because I don't ever want to remember this place. My first night, I wanted to go to I was going to the officers club, and somebody that was in the barricade told me I couldn't go. And I said, why can't I go? And he says, you're wearing jungle fatigues. I says, well, that's all I got. And he said, well, I'm sorry, you can't go. Well, Rick Pinnell probably threw the biggest tantrum you've ever heard in your life. And that was my first indication that maybe things are different back in the country, back in the United States, that even the military maybe were embarrassed by having us back, particularly if we were in an area where people still were in Class A's or regular uniforms. My temper tantrum apparently worked because they brought a higher officer in, and he did eventually let me go to the officers club. I never was sure why that happened or if that happened to other people, but it was a very tough night for my first night back. From there, I went to Fort Meade, Maryland, where I was a company commander of a 300-man company, all Vietnam returnees. The biggest problem we had there, and my responsibility was to take care of all the problems, which mean drugs, alcohol, community issues, and AWOLs. The sad part was most of these people had been drafted or they should have been released from the Army at this stage, but yet they were still stuck there for their time that they had to serve. We had 6 overdose deaths in that time I was there. I had many men coming to me wanting to help because they'd been taken out of hospitals inappropriately and they still were hooked on some drugs. I tried my very best to work with any type of civilian organizations, meth clinics, anything I could. Nobody would take vets. They said, that's not our responsibility. The military solution was prison, put them in jail, which wasn't something that most of the guys wanted to experience. It was hard and very difficult when you saw what was happening. The other part that was hard to deal with was AWOLs. When we bring them back for release from the military with general discharges. They've been in Vietnam for a year. They came back, they just wanted to go home. But yet, because they went AWOL, they got general discharges. Many of them would have problems when they go into town on weekends. They would get in fights in bars and other things because they stood out and people took them on and called them names. So it was a very difficult time. That was my experience. You'll hear different experiences, but all Vietnam returnees. And I think that era was difficult when they had to stay in longer than they should have stayed in. So that was coming home almost was harder than being in Vietnam at times because of the way they were treated. These young men, most of them 18 to 20 years old. So a different experience from somebody who was the same of the era. I'm going to ask John to tell about his experience.
Mine is much less in some ways traumatic, but it also was still something that seems a long time ago, but I can remember distinctly all parts of it. Number one, I was of the generation that if you went to college, your draft deferment was postponed. And I was of the year in which it was the end of the postponements, and I was entered into the first lottery. Now, that was an enormous trauma among all my friends and myself, because the question was your number going to be called low enough that you would get drafted? And number two, if it was, what were you going to do? Were you going to go into the military, or were you in fact going to go to Canada? Because I lived in the upper Midwest and that was the place to go. I was number one. It's funny how you remember these things. I was number 183 in my county. That year, which was 1970, they went to number 184. So I was drafted and I went into the military and I went to Fort Lewis. It was not really a question for me for leaving. I didn't think that that was the right thing to do, even at that time, even though I was deathly afraid of going. But I went to Fort Lewis and I'd never been in this part of the country. It was the middle of the winter. And as you all know, what it does at that time, particularly, is it rained 27 hours a day while you were outside. So when I finally was given a time to get a weekend off, I was still in basic training. You still have to wear your dress uniform. And I thought, well, I've never been to Seattle. I will go into Seattle and go to the Seattle Center. Because I'd heard about the Space Needle, and that wasn't that long before that. And it was the only time I went because I was very much singled out at Seattle Center by people calling me things that, why did you do this? Are you going to go fight this unholy war, or this unfair war? And you might imagine I was not the one who's going to get in fights. So I just went back to the base. But it was a very, very traumatic experience. And later on, I was sent on to Fort Gordon, Georgia, had even more trouble there because Fort Gordon is next to Augusta, and Augusta had a lot of problems. And so going into the, even though I could wear dress, I didn't have to wear dress uniform by that time. It was still pretty apparent that I was in the military and was certainly not treated well. I was fortunate because when it came time for me to actually be deployed overseas, every class up to mine all went to Vietnam. In my class, every other person went to Vietnam because Nixon was going to be running for re-election, and he started the Vietnamization program. And as a result, I went to South Korea. But it was still very much a part of it because we were still on guard all the time about something that would happen. And if in fact we would continue to would go down to Vietnam to relieve forces. We also didn't have any equipment because all the equipment was going to Vietnam. And so my job was pretty hard. But I think the worst part then was coming back, and you went back into civilian life. I was believe it or not, a math teacher in ninth grade. And it really wasn't something you talked about. You went back into the thing, and talking about being in the military and whatnot was not something we would do. But I can remember every aspect of it, and it's now been a few years ago for me anyway. So, and with that, it's certainly not the story that you're going to hear from some of the others, but it did affect people who were not actually in Vietnam. You still had some of the same resentments and whatnot coming about. And with that, I'd like to introduce Russ Mazzola to lead us in prayer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start off with the invocation. Rick asked me to say the prayer. Am I too close to this? Is this coming through okay? Closer? Okay. Dear Creator, bless all who have served. In your kindness, watch over participants, refugees, and victims of war, those separated from their loved ones, and those who are lost. Comfort all those who suffer during times of strife and warfare. Protect the defenseless, heal the wounded, and sustain the homeless and hungry. Turn the hearts of our enemies and forgive all of us for our share in the conflict that brought anguish on humanity. Open to us a way of reconciliation and lead us to a path of peace. In your name, amen. Do you want me to go through? Okay. So Rick has a list of items that he wanted us to talk about. I already gave you my name. When I went in country, I was a second lieutenant. I was an infantry officer. My location was in Quang Tri Province, which is North Vietnam and South Vietnam were divided by the Ben Hao River. There was a border on each side of that river, which is called the DMZ, demilitarized zone. Quang Tri Province bumped up against that zone, and it was bordered on the west by Laos and on the east by the Sea of China. I got there because I was a volunteer. Rick asked me this question. We were on a retreat a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the program today, and he asked me about the draftees in the Marine Corps. And actually, I didn't realize there were draftees in the Marine Corps. I told him no, but I checked with a dear friend of mine last night who was in at the same time I was, and he said there were at times if I guess it was selective service were drafting folks, and the Marine Corps was short, they'd go over to this wherever these recruits are coming in and say, we need 6 more guys, and they'd ship them over to the Marine Corps. So sorry for them, but yeah, that's what I was told. So evidently, Rick, I was wrong. Unusual, but I was wrong. My job when I first got there was a platoon commander, which is about 50 men. Did that for about 6 months. And then became a company commander of hotel company for the 3rd Marines. I had that duty for about 3.5 months. And then I became the assistance operations officer after that. When I got back to the States, I stopped in Okinawa for about probably 2 days and bought the obligatory stereo set and camera, and then returned to California at Camp Pendleton. My job there was the executive officer of what was called 4th Replacement Company at Staging Battalion. What we were doing is shipping people overseas, and so we were doing the administrative processing. And it was odd because the groups were organized by plane loads of young men going overseas. It was an odd way of doing it, but that's what we did. So we just had groups of people going over. What was unusual in that experience, I did that for about 10 months, was some of them, that certainly my generation, remember Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. McNamara was a data guy. He had come from Ford Motor Company, if I recall correctly. And he believed that he could increase, and he was right, he could increase the number of troops that were needed to go overseas by reducing the mental and physical requirements. And he did that by 10% in both categories. And they were called McNamara's 100,000. And the Army got the bulk of them, about 70% of them. The Navy got about 10% of them. The Air Force got 10% of them. The Marine Corps got 10% of them. And it seemed like the 10% the Marine Corps got all came through Camp Pendleton, and I was there. We just had horrific disciplinary problems during that period of time, to the point that I was just really disgusted with the Marine Corps. But that passed, and eventually, yeah, it just passed. Rick also asked how I was treated when I was returning. Obviously, I'm one of the very fortunate ones. Just a little background. So I mentioned that I was sent to Okinawa for a couple of days just to begin the processing out. And then I took a commercial flight to San Francisco International. I had been dating a gal at the time, and I had made arrangements for her to pick me up at the airport. When I got in, I would call her. So when I called her, and this is a sore point even today for me, she couldn't pick me up because she was tied up at work. And so she asked me to take a bus in to downtown San Francisco, where she'd pick me up. And I did that. All the traveling that I did was not in fatigues, as Rick mentioned, but what we called Charlies, which were short sleeve shirts, khaki, and khaki pants. And And so I took the bus in, and I guess I should add that I didn't have hard enough feelings because I married the gal 10 months later. But, and then the next year that I was in the service, Nancy and I kind of courted back and forth. I'd take a flight up to San Francisco once a month from San Diego. She'd come down. All those trips, I was in uniform. And then I actually, after I got to San Francisco, the first time we flew up to Yakima for her niece's wedding, I was in uniform. And the reason I was always in uniform is because at that time you got a 50% discount from the airlines. All the airlines cut your fare off, but you had to be in uniform to do that. And then I flew back to my home state in Ohio. I was fortunate. I never had anybody look at me disrespectfully, say anything disrespectfully. So I evidently escaped what a lot of Vietnam vets incurred. I think that's probably all I got. Excuse me, sometimes I get, not sometimes, probably a lot, I get emotional. About items that mean a lot to me. But my experience overseas was not negative. I mean, it was negative in a lot of ways because of the death, but personally, not for me at all. Absent, I suppose, that death, I'd choose that same course of action again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. And now moving on, Senior Ecker, who's a fixture here in our community, a great fixture, is here to present an Unsung Hero Award.
Well, it's my great pleasure and privilege to present the Unsung Hero Award to the Yakima Warrior Association. The Yakima Warrior Association is one of the most deserving groups in this whole area and really deserving of this award. They should be honored in many more places than they are. I've had the privilege of working with them many times in the past over the years, and they offer so much dignity and so much respect, particularly at funerals of those who are veterans. While it is associated with the Yakima Nation, it is not limited merely to members of the nation at all. As you can see, when they were standing up here, and many of them are representative of different ethnic groups. It's really a privilege today to present this award to the Yakima Association, Yakima Warriors Association, for their dedication to their fellow veterans, whether a special community event, veterans event, or a funeral. The Warriors are they're showing respect for their military brothers, a tradition that reminds us of the sacrificial service that their fellow military brothers have had through history. You exemplify Rotary's motto, service above self. Vic?
On behalf of the Yakima Warriors Association, I thank the Rotary Club very much for this. We're humbled because to receive something like this from a unit like you all, it's very special. We try to serve the community, and we know you serve the community. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, you want to? Oh, yes.
I'm not saying I want to, but I will.
Yeah, we'll give you a microphone. I know that's a good thing, right?
Well, one of the blessings I had from Vietnam and the privileges was to meet Russ Mazzola over there, thousands of miles from here. And we're both in the same community now. And that was one of the blessings and the joys of being in Vietnam. I was stationed with the 2nd Battalion of 3rd Marines over in Vietnam from 1968 and 69. I had joined the Navy a year before, kind of unconscious that the Marines were part of the Navy. You know, you see these posters where the Navy are all dressed in dress whites and on carriers or destroyers. But one of the services that we provide as Navy chaplains is service to the Marine Corps, which we like to remind them is part of the naval service. They don't like to admit that, but they are. And but it's my privilege really to have been there and to have served at a time that the nation was really suffering and really hurting. I was with the combat Marine Corps, the combat infantry battalion out in the field. My luck was I was small enough when the incoming came in, the rockets and mortars, that I could crawl into my helmet and be protected. But I had to endure too, and I get to love those who were in the Marine Corps. They were a wonderful group, probably the finest people I've ever met, those who I've served in the military of all services, particularly the Marines. I have a very warm spot in my heart for them. When I came back from Vietnam, I had a traumatic experience. I'm from Boston. You might have had that idea from that. And I grew up there and went to the seminary there and went back about 2 months after I got back from Vietnam. I happened to go to Boston for a reunion of our class, our priestly ordination class. There were 61 of us. There's only about 8 or 9 of us left, but about 61 of us there that were ordained priests on the same day. I went to a reunion back in 1969 rather, and they used to offer, the airlines used to offer really discount prices for flying for those who were in uniform. So I wore my uniform to this reunion. And I went back to Logan Airport in Boston to fly back to Washington, D.C., where I was called the Southern Planter, because I had all the funerals at Arlington Cemetery. But apart from that, of Navy and Marines and Coast Guard personnel, as I was standing in the airport, just waiting for my flight to be called, there were probably 100 people around that terminal. Some fellow came up, young fellow came up with a loud voice. He just spit in my face. You know what I felt like? Not like a priest. I felt like a Marine. Revenge. Instantly. Because that's an insulting thing. But I didn't do that. Somehow or other, the grace of God or whatever it was prompted me elsewhere. I just called out in a loud voice. People were just standing back in amazement. And I called out in a loud voice, "Thank you very much." I didn't know what that guy had been through. Maybe his brother or family member had been killed in Vietnam. I didn't know. But it was the welcome, the kind of a welcome that many of us got when we got back. People spit in our faces, called us baby killers, and different adjectives that were used in front of that. But it was really a traumatic experience coming back. I was fortunate. I was in my mid-30s at the time. But these kids that came back only in their late teens, 19, 20, they had a terrible time. And PTSD was a common occurrence. I think every military person in Vietnam who was in combat suffers even today from PTSD to some degree or other, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And that's why many of them are homeless. They just don't fit into society anymore. One more thing I just want to mention about my own show, I don't want to take too much time, is this. Yesterday, I had the privilege of preaching a vigil service for Father Murtaugh. He was a longtime pastor in Moxie and at a Holy Family on the west side of the town. And I mentioned that when somebody comes up in our church and we have a funeral there and they come to speak in behalf of the family, I warn them 5 minutes, 5 minutes. And I've got a little button I told them last night. at my chair. And if they go over 5 minutes, I warn them. I'll push the button and you'll sink down into oblivion. But anyways, and I don't want to go over my time either. But also when I came back, came back to Yakima just to visit. And one of my fellow priests said, "You have a disgrace to the priesthood. I could never do that, what you're doing, serving in the military." I said, "Well, that's your choice. I think really you're wrong, but that's your choice." He said, "You have a disgrace being in Vietnam, having been in Vietnam." It was a shock. I didn't expect that kind of a reunion. I'm going back to my brother priest here in this. He later left the priesthood, not too far in advance after that, rather. But that was the kind of reception that many of us got. I could tell you lots of stories about Vietnam, but I don't want to embarrass you or to, and I could do that, but I just stand in admiration today of the warriors and of all you who have served in the military in any branch of service, particularly those who share my own experience in Vietnam. God bless you and thank you.
Thank you very much, Monsignor. And I know all about the button, having spoken a couple times at St. Paul's in eulogies. But I'd like to introduce now Neil Buryan to give our Sergeant at Arms appropriate today. One of the things is I was drafted out of a classroom, and going from 9th grade General Bass students, 9th grade squirrely kids to Vietnam I'm not sure which would have been better at the time when I was drafted, but you could be drafted at any time. And Neil was the working attorney at the time. So Neil.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, how proud I am to be among veterans, combat veterans. I have enormous respect for every one of you. I have enormous pride in my service to the country, and I believe each one of you do. And it's just magnificent to see you here today. In 1966, before the lottery started, they still had the draft. I had school deferments through college and law school, and the Yakima Selective Service System Board sent me a notice in 1966 when I was working for the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office in Seattle. I was deputy prosecuting attorney, sailing along and doing just fine. And all of a sudden I was faced with the draft. So not wanting to just go in as a private, I elected to go enlist. And so I enlisted in a program that took me to Fort Benning, Georgia, and training as a infantry officer candidate school. But on the way there, I had to go through basic training as an E1 and advanced infantry training as an E1, and then to 6 months at Fort Benning, Georgia, to become a second lieutenant in the infantry. I was assigned from Fort Benning to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And at Fort Bragg, I transferred into the JAG Corps and ultimately went to Vietnam as a captain in the JAG Corps as the staff judge advocate for the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, which Lyndon Johnson sent to Vietnam right after Tet in 1968. Spent a year in Vietnam and came back to Fort Lewis, where I had an interesting experience. You may recall the Meline Massacre. The Meline Massacre was a situation where a company commander by the name of William Calley directed that the citizens, the inhabitants of a village in Vietnam called My Lai were rubbed out. They were killed. And so when I came back to Fort Lewis, one of the young NCOs by the name of Hutto, Sergeant Hutto, was charged along with William Calley and some other members of the company with war crimes in connection with that event. And so I was assigned to represent Sergeant Hutto, and we appeared in federal court in Seattle. And so the only incident I have to report about the way I was treated or mistreated was in connection with representation of Sergeant Hutto, probably about sometime in 1969 after I returned from Vietnam. Coming out of the courthouse, I opened the door and Jane Fonda was there. So if any of you know about Jane Fonda, I asked to be for her to get out of the way. She turned around to me and said, "Eat something that I can't say here." That is my experience with Jane Fonda. I have not been particularly fond of Jane Fonda ever since. So there are ways that people treated us. As you know, Jane Fonda was also known as Hanoi Jane. She did a lot of things that were against the members of the military that if you read any of the history about Vietnam and her participation in it, there are people that sympathize with what she did. There are people that don't agree with what she did. At any rate, she was protesting the fact that we were trying to get just some legal remedies for Sergeant Hutto, and she was going around to every place she could to disturb that process. I'm going to read something now just in connection with service. And service as a member of the military, for me, and I think for any of the veterans here, has been a very, very important thing. This is a letter by Frank Schaefer of the Washington Post. And I'm going to read it through, and when I'm done, I'm not going to find anybody, but if you feel moved to give something to, in respect of the honor of the veterans and of the service that they perform, since this is a service club, then I'll ask you to do that. Before my son became a Marine, I never thought much about who was defending me. Now, when I read of the war on terrorism or the coming conflict in Iraq, this was written some years ago, it cuts to my heart. When I see a picture of a member of our military who's been killed, I read his or her name very carefully. Sometimes I cry. In 1999, when the barrel-chested Marine recruiter showed up in dress blues and bedazzled my son, John, I did not stand in the way. John was headstrong, and he seemed to understand these stern, clean men with straight backs and flawless uniforms. I did not. I live in the Volvo driving, higher education worshiping North Shore of Boston. I write novels for a living. I've never served in the military. It had been hard enough sending my two older children off to Georgetown and New York University. John's enlisting was unexpected, so deeply unsettling. I did not relish the prospect of answering the question, quote, "So where is John going to college?" unquote, from the parents who were itching to tell me about how their son or daughter was going to Harvard. At the private high school John attended, no other students were going into the military. Quote, "But aren't the Marines terribly Southern?" unquote, said a lot about open-mindedness in the Northeast. Asked one perplexed mother while standing next to me at a brunch following graduation. Quote, "What a waste. He was such a good student," unquote, said another parent. One parent, a professor at a nearby and rather famous university, spoke up at a school meeting and suggested that the school should, quote, "carefully evaluate what went wrong," unquote. When John graduated from 3 months of boot camp on Parris Island, 3,000 parents and friends were on the parade deck stand. We ex-Marines, I'm sorry about that. We parents and our Marines were not only of many races, but were representative of many economic classes. Many were poor. Some arrived crammed in the backs of pickups, others by bus. John told me that a lot of parents could not afford the trip. We in the audience were white and Native American. We were Hispanic, Arab, African American, and Asian. We were former Marines wearing the scars of battle, or at least baseball caps emblazoned with battle names. We were Southern whites from Nashville and skinheads from New Jersey, black kids from Cleveland, wearing ghetto rags and white ex-cons with ham hock forearms, defaced by jailhouse tattoos. We would not have been mistaken for the educated and well-heeled parents gathered on the lawns of John's private school a half year before. After graduation, one new Marine told John, quote, "Before I was a Marine, if I had ever seen you on my block, I would probably have killed you just because you were standing there," unquote. This was a serious statement from one of John's good friends, a black ex-gang member from Detroit, who, as John said, quote, "would die for me now, just like I'd die for him," unquote. My son has connected me to my country in a way that I was too selfish and insular to experience before. I feel closer to the waitress at our local diner than to some of my oldest friends. She has 2 sons in the Corps. They are facing the same dangers as my boy. When the guy who fixes my car asks me how John is doing, I know he means it. His younger brother is in the Navy. Why were I and the other parents at my son's private school so surprised by his choice? During World War II, the sons and daughters of the most powerful and educated families did their bit. If the idea of the immorality of the Vietnam War was the only reason those lucky enough to go to college dodged the draft, why did we not encourage our children to volunteer for military service? Once that the war was done, something we should all think about and react to. God bless America. Have we wealthy and educated Americans all become pacifists? Is the world a safe place? Or have we just gotten too used to having someone else defend us? What is the future of our democracy when the sons and daughters of the janitors at our elite universities are far more likely to be put in harm's way than any of the students whose dorms their parents clean? I feel shame because it took my sons joining the Marine Corps to make me take notice of who is defending us. I feel hope because perhaps my son is part of a future, quote, greatest generation, unquote. As the storm clouds of war gather, at least I know that I can look to the men and women in uniform in the eye. My son is one of them. He is the best I have to offer. John is my heart. Faith is not about everything turning out okay. Faith is about being okay no matter how things turn out. Oh, how I wish so many of our younger generations could read this article. It makes me so sad to hear the way they talk with no respect for what their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers experienced so they can live in freedom. Freedom has been replaced with free-dumb. Please pass this on. If those of you who would like to donate to Rotary, we welcome your donations. Thank you.
It's a very powerful incentive to get out your pocketbooks here for Rotary charities. Thank you very much, Neil. And now I would like to turn the program over to Rick again, who will not only share his thoughts, but also the thoughts of others about this particular era and thereafter. Rick.
In case you notice, I'm not Francisco Ibarra. Francisco is sick. And I was sick that Francisco was sick. But Francisco and I spent quite a bit of time on the phone, and I'm going to try to fill in what he was going to talk to you about today. One of the things that our theme today was coming home, but that's not the same as welcome home. And if you've heard today, the welcome home was never there. Coming home was there. So I want to discuss the problems from a bigger scale of the changes in the changes that the Vietnam veterans have made since they did come home. They are the most active veterans in the United States since the Vietnam War. However, most of us are getting older. The first problem that Vietnam vets, as you've heard today, is rejection by the public. The public and the media outcry against the Vietnam War, the Vietnam vets, created many problems for returning vets. The VA system's lack of willingness to care for the Vietnam vets forced Vietnam veterans to challenge the VA system. As I was talking to Francisco, I didn't even realize the magnitude of this. I know what was happening in my little company, but I did not know that the magnitude of this, as we've heard today. Movies. If you've ever watched any Vietnam movies, the majority of them are take the dark side of Vietnam War, the atrocities, and very inaccurate and many times dramatized. Was that Hollywood's way of discrediting the war and the military? The only positive movie I ever heard or saw was We Were Soldiers. It's the only accurate and showed a positive side of the military fought and the valor of Vietnam. Vietnam veterans were rejected from American legions, veterans of foreign wars, when they came back. They said that we were not in a war. They said that we did bad things in Vietnam and we had bad reputations, and they didn't want them part of our organizations. That's changed since then, to say the least, in the last few years, because they need Vietnam veterans now. This is the reason that the Vietnam veterans have created some organizations. They've separated the Vietnam Veterans of America in 1978, Council for Vietnam Veterans in DC, and they founded the Vietnam Veterans Foundation. So what happened? What have these foundations done for not only the Vietnam veterans, but all veterans? First was the passing of the Veterans Readjustment Act. VA facilities were not welcome to Vietnam veterans. Vets had mental and physical issues, and the VA did not want to get involved with those types of issues. So this is why this act was done by the Vietnam veterans. What this did was lead to the establishment of what they call vet centers or vet clinics. Vet clinics were started thanks to the Vietnam's Adjustment Act. The act started VA mental health centers all over the United States for Vietnam vets and all veterans to get them help. These centers work with individuals, families, and groups. 90% of their mental health work is with PTSD. We have a representative here today who worked at the vet clinic here for 25 years, Roseanne Umama, back in the corner. Roseanne, thanks for all you did for all of us. It was hard for me to believe that we didn't have that kind of setup before for the Koreans of the World War II, but the Vietnam vets did that. In 1978, we pressed for the recognition of PTSD and finally got that recognized as a mental health issue. The ongoing national Agent Orange campaign, for those of you who don't know about Agent Orange was flown over by airplanes to clear around compounds and bases, so we had better visibility and safety. What they didn't know is it not only killed vegetations, but created very, very serious health problems for many veterans. The recognitions of brown and blue water service from the Navy. This was because the VA did not recognize many of the Navy personnel on ships, and especially those running rivers, as Vietnam veterans. They could not get compensation for injuries, mental or physical. For those of you wondering what brown water means, brown water is those that ran rivers in Vietnam. It was probably one of the most dangerous jobs you could have. For those of you who remember John Kerry, he got a Purple Heart. There's books written about that. And unfortunately, I think some of those books were not fair to him or anybody that ever did that particular job. November 11th is the 40th anniversary of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. This wall, if you have not been to it, is very, very powerful. This wall, we have a miniature wall that's been brought to this community twice. And the person who brought it is sitting right here, Vern Baker. And I tell you, for those of us that visited the wall when Vern brought it. It couldn't have been any more emotional, but it took a lot of work. And Vern, for all of us Vietnam veterans that got to visit the wall, thanks to you. Thank you. I'll never forget the day that I walked up to see the wall, Vern, when it was out at the cemetery out in West Valley, and they were playing 60s music, and there's a bunch of Vietnam bikers sitting there, and seeing that combination was pretty overwhelming, but it meant a lot to all of us in the Valley because of what your work to do that. Every plane today that comes back from a combat zone is greeted by Vietnam veterans. So all these efforts that I've just mentioned, and many, many more, if Francisco's here, was done by Vietnam veterans for all veterans, all military, not just Vietnam vets. It's very important for us to remember that that's why Vietnam vets fought so hard with the VA and the bureaucratic Washington, D.C. The Vietnam veterans of America always say, never again will a generation of veterans abandon another. I repeat, never again will a generation of veterans abandon another. Thank you for today. We do have time for questions. If you want to do it. If we thought we have a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has a question of any of us or any questions at all. I have one question. I'm going to answer it. I always like to ask a question. So this is a story about him. When he went to Vietnam, he took the place of a Baptist minister, chaplain. And so he asked his assistant if he minded working for a Catholic priest. And he said, no, it doesn't matter to me. He was Presbyterian, right? And so Father Monsignor Ecker, of course, he would do mass many, many, many times a day. And the Catholic churches just take mass once a day. That's what you're supposed to take. Well, so Monsignor says, I don't care if you're not Catholic. I don't care if you take communion. That's okay. But let's just do it once a day. He says, why is that? He says, you do it many times a day. He says, yeah, I'm the priest. I have to do it many times a day. He says, well, as far as I'm concerned, good enough for you, good enough for me.
By the way, he became a Presbyterian pastor after he came back.
Are there any other questions? Anybody has anything? I've been back once. Chris has been back. Thanks, Chris.
I just wanted to say that my OCS class at Fort Benning, the 92nd OCS class, graduated in February 1967. 7 of those people were killed in Vietnam, and 1 of them was killed in the attack on the Pentagon in 9/11. He was a 3-star general, the highest officer killed in the Pentagon attack. And another one of my very good friends, Fred Downs, was the head of the Veterans Administration Prosthetics Division for about 35 years. He just retired. He wrote 3 books on Vietnam and went back to Vietnam many times to help the Vietnamese with prosthetics. They did not have any wheelchairs or crutches or anything of the kind. And the kind of service that people did to help the Vietnamese after the war is astonishing. And I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you all very much. I'll just close by saying that even though I was not in country during Vietnam, I certainly was part of that group who was drafted and went through it. But I had friends who actually did go in country, one of whom was a friend since and still is a friend of mine, who I met in third grade. He was a German immigrant, came with his family, did not speak English. And I remember him in our third grade class at Buryan Elementary School. He went on to become a Marine during the Vietnam era and actually was in the JAG Corps and was one of the prosecutors of Lieutenant Calley at the Meline Massacre trials. And he and I have had long discussions when I go back to Dubuque about it. And we come from whole different perspectives, not only Marines, but also somebody who was very much involved in the actual fighting and whatnot. And I think over time, there's been a much better recognition, as we're seeing from this program, of the contributions of the Vietnam veteran and the kind of the coming together, because certainly I was of that same era where there were people, we did not have a college graduation ceremony, for example, because our ceremony was scheduled the day after the Kent State students were killed in a anti-Vietnam War protest. And so we were all part of that same kind of thing. But coming back, there's been this whole recognition. I also have a cousin who's has spent his entire life as a Vietnam veteran in doing exactly those programs you talk about, Rick, with his own support group, or his own group that he works with constantly, who are Vietnam veterans who are still suffering at this day from PTSD. So this has been an incredible program, and I really thank you very much, Rick, for pulling this together. And now to move on, and just to finish up on a lighter note, I don't know if it's possible, but I suppose we could trust Monsignor Ecker to draw the winning ticket here in the lottery.
I wouldn't trust him.
Okay, the winning ticket is 075877. 075877. Well, at least it's a Vietnam era veteran. So now, should I take the top off so you can reach in or not? I don't know. I think you're Sarah. Oh, wait, you can't have that one. Well, yes, you can. It actually has all the money in it too, but you can't take the money. You can only take the marbles which are down there. I know you are an attorney and you'll be looking for the money. It's blue, so that's not good. It's good. It's good for Rotary. Again, thank you all for today. Next week, we'll be back here with Dr. Mike Lawler, president of PNWU. Will be speaking, and we're looking forward to that. So, and with that, there's A&R, the Allocations and Review Committee. We have some grant applications to review. Is meeting directly after in conference room 1, right? Right, conference room 1. Also out at your, where you turn in your badges, you'll see there's a sign up form, a brochure about the Molly Davis golf tournament, which is on July 22nd. And you know, that helps support both our scholarship program and also a lot of the club projects and whatnot, because that's where the money comes for the matching of our club projects. So if you'd like to participate, please pick up a brochure out at the front. June 14th, you can also put in your calendar, that's Flag Day, so that's kind of appropriate for what we're talking about today, is will be the day that we also award the Molly Monroe Davis scholarships, which will be in the afternoon, 5 o'clock at the YVC Convention Center, and we'll be awarding 44 scholarships. So thank you to Molly. So we appreciate that. So we'd love to have you there as well. Although Kelly Connaughton did say this morning there's no liquor, but there is food. So think of that. And the tasting room is nearby. But anyway, again, thank you all. And I believe, unless I forgot something, we are adjourned.